A reserve currency is a currency that is held in significant quantities by governments and institutions as part of their foreign exchange reserves, and that is commonly used in international transactions. People who live in a country that issues a reserve currency can purchase imports and borrow across borders more cheaply than people in other nations because they don't need to exchange their currency to do so. According to economists such as Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, a former French Minister of Finance and President, a reserve currency gets certain benefits called the exorbitant privilege. The US dollar and the euro make up 90% of allocated reserves globally. The United States dollar is the world's most dominant reserve currency, and the world's need for dollars has allowed the United States government as well as Americans to borrow at lower costs, granting them an advantage in excess of $100 billion per year. However, by increasing the value of the dollar, its status as a reserve currency hurts U.S. exporters. Various political leaders from Russia and China have called for the world to move towards a super-sovereign reserve currency. Similar discussions have been had in Europe by the Board for Global Financial Stability. History, as emphasized by the economist Valéry Giscard, reserve currencies come and go. International currencies in the past have included the Chinese liang and Greek drachma, coined in the 5th century BC, the silver punch-marked coins of 4th century India, the Roman denarii, the Byzantine zolidus and Islamic dinar of the Middle Ages, the Venetian ducato of the Renaissance, the 17th century Dutch guilder and of course, more recently, sterling and the dollar-euro. The development of the modern concept of a reserve currency took place in the mid-19th century, with the introduction of national central banks and treasuries and an increasingly integrated global economy. By the 1860s, most industrialized countries had followed the lead of the United Kingdom and put their currency onto the gold standard. At that point the UK was the primary exporter of manufactured goods and services and over 60% of world trade was invoiced in pound sterling. British banks were also expanding overseas. London was the world centre for insurance and commodity markets and British capital was the leading source of foreign investment around the world. Sterling soon became the standard currency used for international commercial transactions. Attempts were made in the interwar period to restore the gold standard. The British Gold Standard Act reintroduced the gold bullion standard in 1925, followed by many other countries. This led to relative stability, followed by deflation, but due to the onset of the Great Depression and other factors, global trade greatly declined and the gold standard fell. Speculative attacks on the pound forced Britain entirely off the gold standard in 1931. By the mid-1930s, many governments introduced tariffs and autarkic policies and the pound sterling lost its dominance as a reserve currency. After World War II, the international financial system was governed by a formal agreement, the Bretton Woods system. Under this system the United States dollar was placed deliberately as the anchor of the system, with the U.S. government guaranteeing other central banks that they could sell their U.S. dollar reserves at a fixed rate for gold. European countries and Japan deliberately devalued their currencies against the dollar in order to boost exports and development. In the late 1960s and early 1970s the system suffered setbacks due to problems pointed out by the Triffin dilemma, a general problem with any fiat currency under a fixed exchange regime, as the dollar was in the Bretton Woods system. Global currency reserves. Thus the following table is a limited view about the global currency reserves that only deals with allocated reserves, the percentile composition of currencies of official foreign exchange reserves since 1995. Theory. Economists debate whether a single reserve currency will always dominate the global economy. Many have recently argued that one currency will almost always dominate due to network externalities, especially in the field of invoicing trade and denominating foreign debt securities, meaning that there are strong incentives to conform to the choice that dominates the marketplace. The argument is that, in the absence of sufficiently large shocks, a currency that dominates the marketplace will not lose much ground to challengers. However, some economists, such as Valéry Giscard, argue that this is not as true when it comes to the denomination of official reserves because the network externalities are not strong. As long as the currency's market is sufficiently liquid, the benefits of reserve diversification are strong, as it insures against large capital losses. The implication is that the world may well soon begin to move away from a financial system dominated uniquely by the US dollar. In the first half of the 20th century, multiple currencies did share the status as primary reserve currencies. Although the British sterling was the largest currency, both the French franc and the German mark shared large portions of the market until the First World War, after which the mark was replaced by the dollar. Since the Second World War, the dollar has dominated official reserves, but this is likely a reflection of the unusual domination of the American economy during this period, as well as official discouragement of reserve status from the potential rivals, Germany and Japan. The top reserve currency is generally selected by the banking community for the strength and stability of the economy in which it is used. Thus, as a currency becomes less stable, or its economy becomes less dominant, bankers may over time abandon it for a currency issued by a larger or more stable economy. This can take a relatively long time, as recognition is important in determining a reserve currency. For example, it took many years after the United States overtook the United Kingdom as the world's largest economy before the dollar overtook sterling as the dominant global reserve currency. Schenck has shown in her 2009 study that in 1944 the US dollar was chosen as the world reference currency, whereas it was only the second currency in global reserves. The G8 also frequently issues public statements as to exchange rates. In the past, due to the Plaza Accord, its predecessor bodies could directly manipulate rates to reverse large trade deficits. Major reserve currencies. United States dollar. The United States dollar is the most widely held currency in the allocated reserves today. Throughout the last decade, an average of 2/3 of the total allocated foreign exchange reserves of countries have been in US dollars. For this reason, the US dollar is said to have reserve currency status, making it somewhat easier for the United States to run higher trade deficits with greatly postponed economic impact or even postponing a currency crisis. Central bank reserves held in dollar-denominated debt, however, are small compared to private holdings of such debt. In the event that non-United States holders of dollar-denominated assets decided to shift holdings to assets denominated in other currencies, there could be serious consequences for the U.S. economy. Changes of this kind are rare, and typically change takes place gradually over time. The markets involved adjust accordingly. However, the dollar remains the favorite reserve currency because it has stability along with assets such as United States Treasury security that have both scale and liquidity. U.S. dollar dominant position in global reserves is very much challenged currently, because of the growing share of unallocated reserves, and because of the doubt regarding dollar stability in the long term. However, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, the dollar-euro unregistered trademark S share in the world euro unregistered trademark S foreign exchange trades rose slightly from 85% in 2010 to 87% in 2013. The dollar's role as the undisputed reserve currency of the world allows the United States to impose unilateral sanctions against actions performed between other countries, for example the American fine against BNP Paribas for violations of U.S. sanctions that were not laws of France or the other countries involved in the transactions. Euro. The euro is currently the second most commonly held reserve currency, comprising approximately a quarter of allocated holdings. After World War II and the rebuilding of the German economy, the German Deutsche Mark gained the status of the second most important reserve currency after the US dollar. When the euro was launched on January 1, 1999, replacing the mark, French franc and 10 other European currencies, it inherited the status of a major reserve currency from the mark. Since then, its contribution to official reserves has risen continually as banks seek to diversify their reserves and trade in the eurozone continues to expand. Former U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan said in September 2007 that the euro could replace the U.S. dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. It is absolutely conceivable that the euro will replace the U.S. dollar as reserve currency, or will be traded as an equally important reserve currency. Econometric analysis by Jeffrey Frankel and Menzi Chin in 2006 suggests the euro may replace the US dollar as the major reserve currency by 2020 if the remaining EU members, including the UK and Denmark, adopt the euro by 2020 or the recent depreciation trend of the dollar persists into the future. In recent years, the euro's increase in the share of the worldwide currency reserve basket has continued to increase a euro, albeit at a slower rate than before the beginning of the worldwide credit crunch-related recession and eurozone crisis, which harmed the euro and slowed its adoption. Since 2009, the reserve currency use of the euro has continued to drop, down to 23.9% in 2013. Other reserve currencies, pound sterling. The United Kingdom's pound sterling was the primary reserve currency of much of the world in the 19th century and first half of the 20th century. The emergence of the USA as an economic superpower, U.S. economic dominance from the second half of the 20th century onward, as well as economic weakness in the UK at various intervals during the second half of the 20th century resulted in sterling losing its status as the world's most reserved currency. Although in the 1950s 55% of global reserves were still held in sterling. The share was a mere 10% lower within 20 years. Since mid-2006 it is the third most widely held reserve currency, having seen a resurgence in popularity in recent years, growing from about 2.5% to around 4% of all currency reserves. Analysts say this resurgence is caused by carry trade investors considering the pound as a stable high-yield proxy to the euro, as well as the position of London in world financial affairs. Japanese yen. Japan's yen is part of the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights valuation. The SDR currency value is determined daily by the IMF, based on the exchange rates of the currencies making up the basket, as quoted at noon at the London market. The valuation basket is reviewed and adjusted every 5 years. The SDR values and yen conversion for government procurement are used by the Japan External Trade Organization for Japan's official procurement in international trade. Swiss franc. The Swiss franc is often considered a reserve currency, because of the perceived stability of the currency and the Swiss banking system. However, the share of all foreign exchange reserves held in Swiss francs has historically been well below 0.5%. The daily trading market turnover of the franc, however, ranked fifth, or about 3.4%, among all currencies in a 2007 survey by the Bank for International Settlements. Canadian dollar. A number of central banks keep Canadian dollars as a reserve currency. In the economy of the Americas, the Canadian dollar plays a similar role to that played by the Australian dollar in the Asia-Pacific region. The Canadian dollar has been an important part of the British, French and Dutch Caribbean states' economies and finance systems since the 1950s. The Canadian dollar is also held by many central banks in Central America and South America. The Canadian dollar is held in Latin America because of remittances and international trade in each nation. Canadian economists primarily define and value the Canadian dollar in terms of the United States dollar, and thus by observing how the Canadian dollar floats in terms of the US dollar, foreign exchange economists can indirectly observe internal behaviors and patterns in the US economy that could not be seen by direct observation. Also, considered a petrodollar, the Canadian dollar has only fully evolved into a global reserve currency since the 1970s when it was floated against all other world currencies. Some economists have attributed the rise of importance of the Canadian dollar to the long-term effects of the Nixon shock that effectively ended the Bretton Woods system of global finance. The Canadian dollar is used as a reserve currency around the world, and in 2007 it was ranked 6th in value held as reserves. Call for new major reserve currency. A report released by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in 2010, called for abandoning the US dollar as the single major reserve currency. The report states that the new reserve system should not be based on a single currency or even multiple national currencies, but instead permit the emission of international liquidity to create a more stable global financial system. Countries such as Russia and the People's Republic of China, central banks, and economic analysts and groups, such as the Gulf Cooperation Council, have expressed a desire to see an independent new currency replace the dollar as the reserve currency. On July 10, 2009, Russian President Medvedev proposed a new world currency at the G8 meeting in London as an alternative reserve currency to replace the dollar. According to economist Michael Hudson, China has said, "We don't want to make any more foreign exchange reserve of any paper currency, because all the paper currencies are government debt currencies." China, Russia, India, Turkey, Brazil, Venezuela and oil-producing countries have recently agreed to transact all of their mutual trade and investment in their own currencies, effectively minimizing the need, at least in the short term, for a global reserve currency. And yet oil is still priced in dollars, which has brought complaints about OPEC's policies of managing oil quotas to maintain dollar price stability. Special drawing rights. Some have proposed the use of the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights as a reserve. China has proposed using SDRs, calculated daily from a basket of US dollar, euro, Japanese yen and British pounds, for international payments. On September 3, 2009, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development issued a report calling for a new reserve currency based on the SDR, managed by a new global reserve bank. The IMF released a report in February 2011, stating that using SDRs could help stabilize the world economy. Chinese yuan. The Chinese yuan or renminbi cannot be used as a reserve currency as long as the Chinese government maintains capital controls on the conversion of its currency. Holding the currency would not be attractive to central banks unless China develops a strong open bond market. The Bank for International Settlements estimates that in 2010 around 0.9% of all currency market transactions were carried out in renminbi. Former Chinese President Hu Jintao said that it would be a long process before the yuan would be accepted as a global currency. However, China has taken modest steps in this direction with currency swap agreements with a few Western Pacific nations. See also, commodity currency, exorbitant privilege, floating currency, foreign exchange reserves, fiat currency, hard currency, Krugerrand, Seigniorage, special drawing rights, Triffin dilemma, world currency, references. Further reading. External links, http://futurefinance.org. The role of money in the economy.